Good morning, and welcome to Shattering Myths, the program devoted to those of you who realize that all of the world's religious, political, economic, military, and media institutions, and most academic institutions as well, are corrupt, that they are in fact counterproductive. I am Yahowah. If you'd like to join us anytime over the next 2 hours, our number is toll-free, 877-300-7645. Most people are unaware of how serious the problem is. But more than 42,000 children and some adults are in forced prostitution. They're engaged in sex slavery. Just currently, as we speak. And the numbers have increased astronomically. There are 9,000 more victims today than there were last year. So the number is increasing by about 9,000 to 10,000 a year. And it's one thing to choose, for whatever reason, to make a living in prostitution. Tough way to make a living. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But this isn't 42,000 women in what they call the world's oldest job. These are women that were, as children, sold into slavery. Now, we know that the epicenter of this is the Islamic world. And it doesn't matter where in the Islamic world, and the numbers are actually far greater than this. You could argue that there are 700 million Muslim women who are sex slaves, because a woman is essentially a slave to her husband, and a daughter is a piece of property to be sold in an Islamic country. So these numbers pale in comparison to the bigger problem. But with the advent of fundamentalist Islamic terrorist groups like Boko Haram, like the Islamic State, sex slavery has escalated considerably. And there are over 10,000 little girls, Christians and Zoroastrians primarily, in both Nigeria, Christians in Nigeria, Zoroastrians and Christians in Iraq and Syria, that have been swept up from their homes by Quran-reciting fundamentalist Muslims, stripped naked, transported in cattle cars, and then gang-raped, only to be sold naked in front of screaming jihadists to the highest bidder, some given away as prizes to the most ruthless jihadist, the best Muslim. And the problem here is that, unlike most cultures where the culture at large is opposed to the slave trade, is opposed to pedophilia, is opposed to forced prostitution, in Islam, these things are not prohibited. In fact, the Quran authorizes sex with slaves. And so you're dealing in a culture, in a religion, whereby the most heinous acts are actually authorized and condoned. That's why in Afghanistan, and that's not recorded here, but in Afghanistan, the government that America has propped up, the warlords that are at the top echelon of that government, that America pays, that America equips with military hardware, that America positions in power, that the highest ranking individuals engage in bazi-bach, the idea that a little boys can be taken from their home, stripped naked, chained to beds, and sodomized for months at end, and then tortured and threatened, beaten. And it's an extraordinarily prevalent practice throughout Islamic countries. The number, according to this particular article, says it's just a fraction of the estimated 1 million people trafficked across borders every year. 1 million little girls, mostly, sometimes little boys, if it's an Islamic country, are kidnapped, enslaved, tortured, gang raped, and then sold as sex slaves. 800,000 a year. In Syria, it says conflict-racked Syria, as opposed to Islamic-wrecked Syria, was relegated to the category of the worst offender. You know, Syria wasn't the worst offender when Assad was in control. Syria is the worst offender now that America and other European and Sunni Islamic nations have aided and abetted the Sunni Mujahideen to fight the Shia government. And as a result, the worst offender is now, our worst offenders are found in Syria. Syria was identified as also a transit country for Iraqi women and girls. Why? Because the United States created the Islamic State through the Awakening program. Once empowered, they then took over large swaths of territory where Sunni Muslims were a majority, and the minority Christians who had been protected under Saddam Hussein, and the minority Zoroastrians who had been protected under Saddam Hussein, had their homes stolen from them. The men were killed, and the women were sold into forced slavery, along with the little girls. Syria and the northern African countries, the Islamic countries, are trafficking little girls for a life of prostitution outside of their own countries, also into Europe. In addition, thousands of women from several nations, almost all Islamic, have been left working for forced domestic servants. And this is true of America's allies in the Islamic world. Nothing worse than Saudi Arabia, where those who come to Saudi Arabia to work as domestic servants have their passports seized, have the contracts that they were lured into Saudi Arabia confiscated, and then they are treated as slaves. But worse, they are routinely beaten by the women who are beaten by the men in Saudi Arabia. The victim is the miser in this horrid religion. None more than Filipino women. They are trapped inside of cities throughout not only Syria, but also throughout the Islamic world. Now, turning a little closer to home, this is something that most Americans are unaware of. Tens of thousands of American children are sexually exploited every year. Tens of thousands. Or the numbers in the millions in the Islamic world. It is tens of thousands in America. It is believed, according to the FBI, that every night many hundreds of little girls are sold for sex. The FBI says that child sex abuse is almost as epidemic as is rape, despite the agencies rescuing 600 children from sex slavery last year. Trafficking often conjures images of people from other countries being smuggled over land and across the sea and then forced to work against their will in foreign lands. People are trafficked into America from Mexico, Central and South America, but the vast majority, according to the FBI, of the children bought and sold for sex every night in the United States are American children. Tens of thousands of American children are bought and sold as sex slaves. We have heard from a number of women from the East Coast to the Midwest who have frighteningly similar and horrific stories. Neglected, abused, exploited, and often ignored, starting from a young age, sometimes even prosecuted by the very people who should have protected them. It's a complete breakdown of values. It's a derivative of the national religion, the religion of politics and academia, political correctness. There's no sense of values, no sense of right and wrong, no sense of responsibility, no sense whatsoever of morality. And so children, the most precious thing in the world, are neglected, they're abused, they're exploited. The antithesis of what a family should be. In Minnesota, one woman says she was bought by her aunt at age 14. She gave my mom $900, told me I was going to the shopping mall. That aunt would bring her to her drug dealers, where she was raped and given drugs. She bought her for $900 because she could leverage sex with a 14-year-old with the drug dealers into a far greater amount of drugs than $900 would buy. And so the aunt took a 14-year-old to her drug dealers where she was routinely raped. She would just leave me. And then I was like, you're so messed up with all the drugs that you wanted to stay. She soon believed that the abuse was her fault and her choice. A 14-year-old girl. Another woman says she was 17 when she was kicked out of the house. I wanted to get high. She says, I wanted to turn off the pain. I turned to working as a prostitute. She later started using classified advertisements on a website, I guess it's called Backpage, to make more money and to keep up with her addiction. A third was 14 when she was kidnapped. She didn't return home for 2 years, treated as a sex slave. We'll return to this topic and its consequence in a moment. One woman said of her abuser, he knew I was 14. He had to know that I was underage. When he actually found out for certain how old I was, it didn't stop him. He wanted even more. A woman who was first trafficked at 13 says that she's living in a shelter now and is struggling not to return to prostitution. There's Trick's name still on my phone, she said. I haven't deleted any of them yet. And I need to delete them, she says, because when I get down and when I'm feeling really yucky, it's almost like I want to have that number there. You know, it's the nature of abuse. It's why Islam continues to prevail. Even if the attention is only demeaning and negative, it's still attention. We crave attention. And here's a woman who was kidnapped and forced to be a sex slave at 14, was prostituted out by the man that owned her, and now to feel good, to feel wanted. She feels the need to be a prostitute again. She says she doesn't want to return to that life, but she says it's a big, nasty circle. You get high, you get tricked, you get some money. You get high, you get tricked, you get some money. It goes on and on, around and around. And you have to break it off with all of them, but it's hard to do. It's an uphill battle, she said. She said, I finally did stop when my when I was 22. And I had my first son, detailing her on and off experience, but then I went back to it. She's been away now for 7 months, partly because she is pregnant with her 4th child. Imagine, her as a mother. Her life ruined, not her fault. I just want my freedom back, one woman says. I want to look out for my kids. I want to live my life. I want to have a normal life, but it's the problem with pedophilia. It's why it's such a horrible crime. It's why I despise the Roman Catholic Church so much. It's why I despise Islam so much, the world's largest and second largest perpetrator of pedophilia in the world, with, of course, Islam being by far the greatest perpetrator of pedophilia, and then followed by Roman Catholicism. I just want my life back. But for women who were sold for sex as children, the abuse, the drugs, all of it became part of their normal. She says, this one woman says, I was groomed from the age of 12 by a neighbor. He enticed me into his garage, which was full of toys and games. He began by offering her money at 12 years old for topless photos. I see more and more younger girls out there, and he says it's really sad. It's not a choice at 12. It's not a choice. It's never right. This is a related story, but different in a way. The sex abusing children always has to be wrong. Muhammad was a pedophile. There's no excuse for pedophilia. Islam condones pedophilia. Islam is the greatest perpetrator of pedophilia. And Roman Catholicism is the second greatest. These organizations need to be exposed and condemned. They need to be isolated. They need to be contained and declared illegal for the horrid crimes that they have perpetrated. But when it comes to a grown woman of her own volition choosing to engage in prostitution, I would view it differently, as does Amnesty International. Amnesty International and some celebrities like Anne Hathaway, U2, and Jon Stewart now find themselves on the opposite ends of many civil rights groups over legalizing prostitution. For those who have listened to this program for some time, you know that, well, I'm anti-political. If I were political, I'd be a libertarian. I see Yahowah as a libertarian. That you ought to have freedom to choose. So long as what you're doing is not hurting someone else, you ought to be free to do it. You ought to be free to take drugs. You ought to be free to drive your motorcycle without a helmet. You ought to be free to drive your car without a seatbelt. You ought to be free to do any kind of drug that you wish to do. You ought to be free to engage in or be a supplier of prostitution. These things are all counterproductive. These things are all harmful. You ought not do any of them. You ought to know that to do any of them, there is a consequence, that it is inappropriate, it's dangerous, not good. But you ought to be free to do them. And that's my stand on this, and I'm open to others who have a different point of view. But there is a major movement worldwide to legalize the oldest profession. This particular article is saying that a prominent human rights organization like Amnesty should be listening to the sex trade victims, a woman's advocate group is suggesting. You know, and there are arguments to be made on both sides, but the model that is being accepted now in most countries, was accepted recently in Korea, Norway, Iceland, Canada. It's called the Nordic model. It was passed in Sweden here recently. Says that to engage in prostitution is to be considered a violence against women and a human rights abuse, and therefore the person who is paying for the sex, not the sex worker, is prosecuted, and the prostitute themselves is treated as a victim. Is the Nordic model, but there are those on the other side who say just legalize it. Let the women receive some benefits, some protections, and don't criminalize it and so marginalize these women. What do you think, Glenn?
I don't know. First things first, Hedda. The marketing dinglings have the owner of the network saying, our T's and C's Okay, artesian, which means like a deep well, artesian well, deep in the ground. It's not artisan, it's artisan deep. Somebody stop them before they speak again, please, God.
That's true. Yeah, artesian is a well that's deep in the ground, and an artisan is a person that is good at art or crafts. You know, it was interesting. The one that I thought was just hilarious was the one that was talking about Amish pastured cows, as if a cow could be that milk from a cow that is herded by a religious fundamentalist, wackos really, is somehow more pure, more beneficial, and that you would actually state that as an asset, your milk came from Amish pastured cows.
Well, perhaps in the sense that they, use less artificial stuff, or maybe use less hormones or something. Who knows? Yeah, but I got you.
All right,
but anyway,
you can say free-range cows.
Right. About the freedom thing. My caveat, one caveat I would say about the freedom thing is, yeah, it's fine. Like I used to ride a motorcycle, and I always wore a helmet, and they let people ride without helmets. That's fine, but if your skull gets smashed in, then please don't ask me to pay for your hospital bill.
Yeah, that's my view too. Yeah, that's my view too. In fact, I would even take it further. Like I've been seeing on the sports channels that I watch, big advertising push for a diabetes drug, and 100% of the people that they are showing with the drug are always obese, and the people that don't need the drug, that are just in the background or in the scene, are always thin. And you're going to say, if you're going to be obese, I don't want to be paying for, and in today's world with socialized medicine, we're all paying for other people's abuse. Like I don't want to be paying for food stamps for somebody that's obese. And if I agree, if you smoke cigarettes, I'm not paying for your cancer treatment.
Right.
Exactly. You should take some responsibility, some accountability. You want to drive a motorcycle without a helmet, that's just fine. It's not good. It's stupid. But you ought to be allowed to do it so long as if you get your brain scrambled, you can't, you're going to have to pay for the cost of unscrambling it. It shouldn't be on insurance, and it shouldn't be on the government.
Well, this is everything from too big to fail banks right down to abortion funding. It's everybody wants to bail. Everybody wants to do what they do, then everybody wants to bail out.
Right.
So,
yeah, everybody wants somebody else to pay for whatever it is that they think that they deserve. And I don't think if you're obese, I don't think you deserve food stamps. If you're lost control over your health and your weight, then we ought not be funding your diabetes medicine.
Well, there is the irony, and I think you already addressed this the other week, where it's one of the few countries where you can be poor. In fact, and part of that is because when people don't have enough money for more nutritive food, they buy the less nutritive food, which is very expensive. So it's a matter of commitment, education, and resources there. And it's very hard to as someone who is still fluffy. I know you lost some weight, but as someone who's still somewhat fluffy. I suffer for it a bit, and I know better because I'm a nurse, right? So knowing better doesn't always mean you do better. I'm empathetic to the struggle.
I am both empathetic to the struggle that I was having. I was probably 40 pounds overweight for more than a decade. But I'm also aware that if you just put your mind to it, if you take responsibility for yourself and say, I'm going to exercise 5 days a week for 45 minutes to an hour, which isn't hard to do, and I'm going to eat more responsibly, which is not hard to do. I dropped 50 pounds, and I've maintained it off. And I've gone back to eating almost anything I want to eat. But so long as you work out, you can eat whatever you want. But you got to combine these things, and the difference too is that people who don't take responsibility will typically take we'll go to the fast food restaurants. Is why, boy, you look at cities today and they're just lined with fast food, unhealthy food restaurants. People just I want it instantly. I don't want to have to go to the grocery store and buy the food and have to prepare it and then cook it and then clean up after it. But more nights than not, that's what we do.
Right. And it's very odd. I look at the produce department and the variety, all the different types of fruits and vegetables they sell. And I think, wow, are enough, it amazes me. I'm glad to hear that apparently there's still enough people purchasing and, cooking and preparing these foods. You know what I mean? I rue the day when all of a sudden that variety of fruits and vegetables is gone, because they only have less nutritious stuff. But,
so it's again, I think it is a matter of education, a matter of motivation, a matter of attitude, and I think that when you create a dependent culture, a culture that is cradled with Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps and housing allowances and all these kinds of things, when you do that, you create a culture where no one is willing to be accountable or take responsibility, that the effort it takes to achieve a positive outcome is forfeited. People don't think they should have to work to achieve the desired result. It should be they're entitled to do it. That's why they're called entitlements.
Okay, and now for the topic of toplessness. Now,
yes.
It was been my understanding that I think New York City had an ordinance a long time ago. Theoretically, I think a woman can walk in New York topless or something. But it's if enough people avail themselves of that privilege, there won't be so much clamoring for it.
Well, it's true. Yeah.
It's like, wow, this is really a bad idea. And you know what? It won't take long before the women themselves realize this is physically uncomfortable. This is not. I think they'll change their minds fairly quickly.
Yeah. First of all, I don't have an issue with toplessness. I think that if men can go to the beach without shirts, women ought to be able to go to the beach without shirts. It's just an issue that does not bother me at all. But and I just think that things ought to be fair. Now, that said, most people take very poor care of their bodies. No matter where you go, you look around, people are really out of shape. And because of that, most people aren't attractive. They aren't attractive in clothes, and I would shudder to think what they look like without clothes. So, it ain't a turn on, it's a turn off. It would just go, oh, God.
Well, they had one of those protests, I think, somewhere recently where they showed, all these topless, all these people were supposed to be a nude bike ride or something, but, most people know it's semi-nude. But it's like, but if you've ever seen one of these artist photos where they, actually that's fairly instructive. There was some artist who did these photos of thousands of naked people and everything. And it's like, wow, okay, put them all back on quickly.
Seeing lots of people that close together in a non-sexual setting, but naked. I remember seeing some of those pictures and saying, this is really unappealing.
Right. And I include myself in that number. I harbor no delusions of grandeur. I'm definitely one of the ones that think, okay, put your shirt back on as quickly as possible. I occasionally will be seen in swim trunks at the seaside or next to a pool, but then when I'm done, I put my shirt back on.
Yeah, there you go.
It's been a long time since I had a six-pack.
Yeah. What I care about, though, is, for example, what we're getting out of the Sudan. I don't know if you've heard, but the Sudanese army and the allied militias are now abducting, torturing, and gang raping girls.
Oh, no, that's terrific.
It's epidemic.
It's so barbaric. Like, why would you, I don't know. It's like, that's just crazy. I'm thinking. But
then you look at it in America. So we have tens of thousands of little girls that are sold for sex in America, and then you look at the U.S. military, where a woman is 8 times more likely to be sexually abused in the military than she is outside of the military. And not only is she 8 times more likely to be abused in the military, there is only 1% of the perpetrators are prosecuted. And if you want to be a rapist, do so in the U.S. military, because you won't be prosecuted. And the victims, it's just like the Roman Catholic Church. The victims are more victimized by the institution than they are by the predator.
Right.
Oh, it's just repulsive. And you know, the second most common place, so the place without any freedom, where you are not allowed to exercise your own good judgment, where you are wholly and completely indoctrinated on patriotism, the military, is the single worst place to be a woman in America. That's where you're most likely to be sexually abused. You know what the second most likely place is?
Nope.
Yeah, the high temple of political correctness, America's premier academic institutions. On average, 25% of the students during their 4 years at a premier academic institution, 25% will be sexually abused. Maybe there's a connection there that we ought to be thinking about. There's something wrong with political correctness. Here in the Sudan, a country ravaged by Islamic malfeasance, Islamic genocide, 2.5 million people killed. One woman says she was dragged out of her hut and gang raped in front of her 3-year-old child. Imagine trying to recover from that. The UN mission in the Sudan said the abuses during the 18-month civil war had reached a new scale of intensity and horror. Survivors spoke of a campaign against the local population where they killed the men, they destroyed the villages, they raped the women, and then to leave no evidence behind, they burnt the survivors alive in their homes. Boy, it's a lovely world, isn't it?
Barbarity beyond description. I mean,
yeah.
You know, I can't even fathom it, frankly.
You know what's extraordinarily amazing is that the world doesn't seem to understand the plight that it is in relative to the Syrian war. And it's not just the immigration issue, which is catastrophic. It's not just the death toll, which is catastrophic. It's not just the kidnap and enslavement and gang rape of women by the tens of thousands, which is catastrophic. It's the fact that it's now a world war. You've got Russia and China up to their eyeballs on one side, and the United States and Europe up to their eyeballs on the other side. And here's the United States that started this damn war, that's been bombing both countries into oblivion, that's providing the weapons for both sides, and it's telling the Russians that what they're doing is counterproductive.
Right, where they seem to have been getting amazing results in a very short period. But I'm wondering, if the Russians and the Chinese begin to have, a more comprehensive effect, that is start to get things turned around according to their goals and start to win, I'm wondering if that's what ends up being the precursor to the devastation of Damascus, because if it could be like, yes, okay, they're winning. Then all it says that, okay, no, they're not. Somebody pushes the button, and then Damascus ends up, in fulfillment of Isaiah 17 and Jeremiah 49, ends up destroyed.
Yeah, well, you've got very egotistical countries now on both sides. You've got, NATO having created the mess in the Ukraine to revitalize its purpose is now yapping up a storm, running all sorts of the largest exercises really in the history of Europe being coordinated by NATO now in opposition to Russia. Even though Russia hasn't challenged any European country. But NATO says, we got your back, we're there for you. And so NATO now has the purpose that it sought when it perpetrated this war in Ukraine. And then you've got the United States doing an audit of the CIA to find out why we were blindsided by the Russian intervention. I mean, how could you be blindsided by Russia arming and equipping and protecting Assad? I mean, would you have to have your head in the sand?
Well, the great chess move was, allowing us to declare that we are fighting ISIS, and all they had to do was say, oh, okay, yeah, good, we're fighting ISIS too, and we're fighting it at the invitation of the head of the legitimate government.
Yeah. What's really interesting is that, of course, the Russians aren't fighting ISIS. They're fighting al-Nusra. And they're fighting al-Nusra because, as we've reported now for the past 3 years, al-Nusra is fighting Assad, where ISIS is fighting Shia Muslims.
Right.
So.
Right. And it's interesting, yeah. So, ISIS, I don't know, apparently, being like this wild card, pack of mad dogs that's being manipulated, This just seems to me, that those who are funding and facilitating ISIS believe that then when they're done, ISIS is done doing the damage they want done, then they can control ISIS or liquidate it or whatever they're going to do.
Oh, of course, and they know they can't, so they know they're in a horrible fix. They want to continue to lash out against the increased power of Iran after the American invasion of Iraq gave much of Iraq to Iran. But by the same token, they know that the Islamic State is not going to sit idly by. It will continue to expand into fundamentalist Sunni territories. But there can't be a single informed and sane, rational individual on the planet that can actually believe that outing Assad is better for Syria and the world.